I'm tempted to do what Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and say the answer is 42 and stop. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was here on the 9th of December 2003 for the last European Competition Day hosted by the Italian presidency. And the topic I discussed then was liberalization, competition, and economic growth. So there is a sense of very pleasant déjà vu about this, this occasion. I'm going to try and cover two things. One is the link between competition and productivity growth and the sort of evidence from competition policy, which links into what some other speakers are talking about. And then I'm going to talk about what are the implications for how we do competition policy. And to be a little bit provocative, I'm going to suggest that the competition policymakers and policymakers in Europe are a bit like the economics professor who the student finds searching under a light in the car park outside the economics faculty at night, and the student asks the professor, what are you looking for? And the professor says, I'm looking for my keys. So the student helps the professor for some 15 minutes to search for the keys under the light. It's in the evening. And eventually, the student says to the professor, where exactly do you think you dropped the keys? And the professor points out into the dark and says, over there. And the student says, why are you searching here? And the professor says, because there's light here. And I do think that we are in danger of doing that with competition policy in Europe, and I'll explain that comment when I come to it. So competition has a central role to play in productivity growth, and people have talked about that. Paul Krugman has said, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. And there are several effects. Andrea has mentioned these in his diagram. There's incentive effects. The incentive to reduce prices causes incentive to reduce costs. There's selection effects. Inefficient firms are replaced by more efficient firms, and there's innovation effects where existing business models are replaced by disruptive new businesses. I'm going to give you some examples just under each of those headings, and there's a purpose to this. So on incentive effects, the extent to price rivalry drives cost reduction is probably best seen in the airline industry. In 2006, the Office of Fair Trading brought a consumer action threatened a consumer action against the 11 airlines then operating in the UK market on the way they advertised prices on their website. Everybody advertised £5 or £2, and then all the hidden charges or extra charges came later in the booking process. And we interpreted the law as saying all essential charges had to be up front. And when we later evaluated that intervention, our calculation was there was a net welfare benefit of 120 million a year from the increased price competition. And that was not simply a transfer from shareholders to consumers. This was our measured overall welfare effect, taking account of the fact that airlines, it put in pressure on airlines to reduce costs. So the way incentive effects work in competition is that not just prices come down, but when prices come down, companies have stronger incentives to cut costs. And you see that in a whole lot of powerfully competitive sectors of the economy, the retail sector in the UK, the airline sector, and other sectors. And very, very substantial benefits from incentive effects. The second area is selection effects, where the market selects the most efficient firms. And here we can also see that in airlines, where low-cost airlines coming into the market delivered lots of benefits for people who switched them. But they also delivered benefits for the people who didn't switch to them, because the incumbent carriers had to lower their prices as well. So the 90% of people who don't switch receive a huge benefit from the 10% who do switch. And new business models, new ways of saving costs are very often driven by people outside of the current market who come into the market. A nice example of that in the UK was supermarkets entering petrol retailing, and petrol prices set by retailers who were linked to the oil majors was the standard way of doing things until 20 years ago. And there's a good deal of evidence that the challenge to what's called rocket and feather pricing in petrol, where prices go up like rockets and down like feathers in response to global oil price movements, that in the UK, the downward prices are driven by the supermarkets moving first. They have a different business strategy as new entrants in those markets. The effects here have been big. Airfares in Europe over the 20-year period after liberalization fell by 65% in real terms, and number of routes went up by 70%. On international telephone calls in Europe, they came down by over 90% in real terms. And these are not just benefits for European citizens and benefits for the internal market, because international phone calls are across the internal market, but they're also benefits for small businesses, which further trickle down into the economy. So they've had a huge benefit. And then the third is innovation effects, where existing business models are replaced by disruptive new ones. And Federico talked about the relationship between innovation and competition, and there is an ambiguous relationship there. But there's some areas where it's not at all ambiguous. So it is not at all ambiguous that allowing business models like Uber and Airbnb to come into the taxi and accommodation market, this is really quite a good thing for the consumer and quite a good thing for competition. But in many European countries, it's stopped. And if Europe wants to encourage innovation, it needs to develop regulatory systems that support innovative businesses. You don't make omelets without breaking eggs, and you don't, we can't be like chefs in a kitchen who have a phobia about sharp knives. And that's what we're like in Europe about regulation that stops disruptive entrants. One of the big areas where this is going to become more and more important is in retail banking. Retail banking is poised for a disruptive revolution using data and other things that has the potential to be stopped by existing bank regulation, and that's going to be another example where other countries may move ahead way before Europe does. So I think we should worry about these. So the cost of lost competition can be huge. One of the biggest costs is the misallocation of talent. As bright school leavers get attracted into rent-seeking sectors of the economy, like pharmacy, lobbying, banking, areas of banking that add little value for the economy, and lawyers have been mentioned. In fact, on your point about career professions, there's a lovely paper in the American Economic Review in '93 by Murphy, Slifer, and Vishny, in which they show a positive relationship between the ratio of engineers to lawyers and economic growth. And their view is that the more engineers you have in the economy, the more growth you have, because they're driving real productivity growth in the economy. And the more lawyers you have, the more rent-seeking you have, because it's about how to move money around, existing money around, rather than to grow the pot. So if you spend more time fighting over the size of the pie rather than growing the pie, you won't grow. And that's an unfair characterization of lawyers and somebody who's sometimes potentially earning money from rent moving. But I accept that it's a crude characterization. But in Ireland, there was a quantitative limit on the number of pharmacists. So the brightest 40 people every year became pharmacists, which is a form of glorified shopkeeping. And at the same time, the government had a policy of trying to encourage Ireland as the leading location in Europe for research in biotechnology. But these people could have been the brightest scientists, but instead they were going into shopkeeping. It was a crazy misallocation of talent, and that's a 40-year cost to the economy. So we should really worry about these hidden costs of the lack of competition. What are the policy implications for this? So I think Europe has a great competition policy in many respects, but I think there are three areas where it needs to change, and needs to change radically. And the first is that European competition policy needs to have a much stronger focus on the link between the state and markets. All the examples I've given of where there are very big gains from competition have come from removing state restrictions on competition, airlines, telecoms, in the professions and in other areas. I struggle to find examples where cartel enforcement or monopoly enforcement has had such big, widespread productivity effects on the economy. And I firmly believe, after 15 years of being involved in competition policy enforcement, that the biggest gains across Europe and in many other countries are from breaking the link between state protection from competition. And the reason for that is that the state is much more persistent in the market. People may get a cartel for a while or a monopoly for a while, and we should worry about that, and we should enforce the law. I'm not saying we go soft on that, but we do quite a lot on that, and we don't really do enough on state restrictions on competition. Now, we have excellent state aid control in Europe. Other countries don't have it, but member states lack equivalent powers. We have never really had a serious discussion about the decentralization of, I think it's now called Article 106. I think I spoke about that in Rome 11 years ago. I've long thought that the competition authorities of the member states should be able to challenge domestic restrictions on competition. For example, with Uber and Airbnb, it is usually city regulators that are stopping competition in those markets. Why shouldn't competition authorities be able to take the city government to court for these issues and apply a higher standard? The European Commission could do it, but subsidiarity means that the Commission can't get involved in every local taxi market. But it should be enabling our competition authorities to do this. And I think in that context, and it touches on a point, Andreas, competition authorities need to get more sophisticated about advising governments on how to compensate losers from the regulatory process, while at the same time not compensating them so much that it gives incentives to build up monopolies in the first place. In Ireland, I was responsible for the liberalisation of the taxi market with a proposal to give a second licence to every taxi driver. That reduced public sympathy for their cause because everybody perceived they got a second licence that they could trade. But there was also a compensation scheme for widows and for drivers coming up to retirement who lost the value of their licence. And I thought that was a measured response. The compensation scheme was worth about 10% of the total value of the outstanding licences. So it struck the correct balance. So I don't think we think hard enough about the stranded costs and how to deal with them. So that's the first area. There's much stronger focus on competition and the link between the state and business. The second area is to focus our competition policy interventions on dynamic factors, not static ones. In all of the three areas where we know that competition policy drives economic growth, incentive effects, selection effects, and innovation effects, it does so by a process of dynamic change. It is not a static concept. So we should worry about consumer switching, we should worry about price rivalry, and we should worry about entry and exit and expansion, and how regulation and other things stop those from happening. In contrast, I'm going to give some examples of what competition authorities are doing at the moment. The competition authorities in the UK at the moment have just broken up two companies with 40% market share in actions which don't really address barriers to entry in the market. They're simply creating an N+1 firm market instead of an N firm market with the same barriers to entry that exist. There's a little bit of work on easing entry, but they haven't really tackled barriers to entry and the remedies. They're just restructuring the market. Politicians in the UK, meanwhile, are suggesting market share caps and further restructuring, putting further pressure on authorities in that direction. Not enough focus on dynamics. Too many agencies around the world are focused on bargaining disputes in the supply chain, that have almost no impact on growth. And supply chains are a huge source of productivity growth for businesses. And it's not obvious to me that competition authorities should be getting involved in disputes between firms that are large buyers from small suppliers, when in actual fact what they're doing is passing on downstream competition to the supply chain. But yet, this is a large volume of activity in some competition authorities. Too many competition agencies are still pandering to inefficient failing firms who use the competition process to protect themselves from competition. And then I think we have a fetish with fines for cartels. And I have seen very little evidence on the link between the size of fines and the overall level of economic growth. And too many competition authorities are being measured by their governments on the number of fines and the volume of fines they impose, and not on actually the outcomes that they produce in markets. So I think there's a little bit of a problem with the way in which competition authorities are incentivized by their governments and the way in which competition authorities measure their performance that focuses too much on static factors and creates too much focus on things that are not really benefiting consumers and economic growth. My third area, and it links back to Magda's comments, is on how we join up consumer and competition policy. Many of the biggest barriers to competition come from consumer switching, and you made this point about how consumers compare financial products and financial literacy. In the UK, if you ask consumers, randomly ask 100 consumers to choose between £30 and 10% of £350, 20% of them will choose £30. So 20% of consumers cannot calculate a simple percentage, okay? So, and we expect these people to look after their pensions, get mortgages, switch bank accounts, etc., etc. As the airline case, the OFT airline case shows, consumer enforcement interventions can have a huge impact on incentive effects inside business and on driving competition. And most consumer-facing businesses these days are using behavioral economics, which, by the way, they call marketing, to do sophisticated yield management. So they're trying to work out, and they use new technology for this, Industrial organization economists in the 1980s developed sophisticated theories of price discrimination. They got taught to MBA students in business schools in the 90s, and these people now work in the strategy departments of most businesses in the noughties. And now almost all businesses, take supermarkets for example, use loyalty programs and other data schemes and very sophisticated data techniques to work out which one of you is going to spend more in the supermarket if they move this price a little bit and how much more they can get out of this other person. So we have this very, very sophisticated yield management and price discrimination. You see it with airlines, you see it with supermarkets, and you see it everywhere else. And personal data are being used to do this, and we hand it over all the time. Now, one challenge from this sophisticated price discrimination is political. When price discrimination is progressive, as it is in airlines. In airlines, rich people pay more for tickets and they subsidize the poor people in the back of the plane. Politicians don't mind. But when it's regressive, they don't like it at all. And in the energy market in the UK, when competition got going between 2002 and 2008, it was largely upper income consumers who switched and got good deals. So the government introduced a non-discrimination requirement in 2008 through the regulator, which was politically motivated. One of the members of the regulator resigned in protest at the time, George Yarrow, a very distinguished economist. But it went ahead nonetheless. And as a result of that, prices for the people who were switching went up by 6%, but the prices for the others didn't come down. So everybody just paid higher prices. Wasn't a particularly good intervention. We didn't satisfy the politicians because, of course, now prices were higher, and now we have a whole inquiry into the energy sector that's been very politically motivated. And so politicians don't like sophisticated price discrimination if it produces regressive outcomes, and competition authorities could be offside on that issue. More importantly, if we really want to understand how competition works in these markets, we need to understand the consumer side of the market, and not enough competition authorities are on top of this issue. In the UK, I fought a huge battle for 3 years with the government to keep competition powers in the new Competition Markets Authority, and I'm very pleased that the leadership of that agency is taking this seriously. Marguerite Vestager talked about the need for competition authorities to understand personal data, but most agencies lack the tools to do that at the moment. And the fragmentation of consumer responsibilities across the new European Commission in Brussels means that this is an area of policy in Europe where I think the leadership of the new European Commission has completely lost the plot, because if the European Union is going to mean something to the European consumer, we need really strong consumer policy at the center of European competition policy as well. And we do not have that at the moment, and it's not working well. So these are the three areas where I think competition policy in Europe needs to focus. A much stronger link between the state and restrictions on competition imposed by the state, particularly at member state level, focused on dynamic, not static factors, and joining up consumer and competition policy. I'll finish by going back to a British economist, David Ricardo, who distinguished between the intensive and extensive margin in agriculture. And increases on the intensive margin consist of getting more output from land that's already cultivated. And increases on the extensive margin consist of getting output from land not previously cultivated. And in European competition policy, we heard this morning about the many excellent changes that have been made to the European competition network and refinements of that. And I would contend that that is land that is already being cultivated, and it's already very productive. And we can get extra little productivity gains from tweaking the European competition network and how we enforce the law against private firms. But there are these other areas that are a little bit more difficult because we haven't cultivated them fully, and that's the extensive margin, and it is not happening. And I think if competition policy in Europe wants to be relevant and play a key role in driving growth, it's going to have to change and face up to those challenges. Thank you very much.